Hello and welcome to the next episode of my Learn With Me Hydrasynth series. This is episode 25, Final Overview. So first, what is Learn With Me? Learn With Me is a series where you follow, or hopefully have been following, my end-to-end journey of learning to get the best out of a synthesizer. In this case, it's been the Ashen Sound Machine's Hydrasynth Explorer. I've covered all of its features, I've given you my initial overview, but now a few months have passed since I originally acquired the synthesizer, and I would like to give you my summary of my experience in using it beyond a sort of deep dive into the features. I'm going to do that by first telling you what I think about it. I'm going to go through a few of the patches. In the last episode, you saw that firmware 2.0 was released, which added some new features and added new factory banks and new patches updated for 2.0. So I haven't actually heard these patches, so this is going to be a fairly random process. But first, what do I think of this synthesizer? At the highest level, I would say I like this synthesizer, but I don't love this synthesizer. I will be keeping it, and I'm sure I will be using it, but I haven't quite got attached enough or enthused enough about the things that it does to make it central to my setup. That doesn't necessarily mean that nobody will, but I will talk about what I like and what I don't like and how I will be using it and how I think it is best used. First, build quality. I think it's excellent. I think for the price, or even for any price, very, very robust construction, really solid encoders, really nice rotary switches, really nice knobs. The buttons all feel good, nice displays, nice bright LEDs, useful information conveyed by those LEDs, touch strips work well. Really nothing to complain about construction-wise. Overall feature set-wise, I think it's a subtractive synth, but it's a kitchen sink subtractive synth. I think it adds a lot of everything. So 5 envelopes, which can also be looped, 5 LFOs, which can also be one-shotted. The LFOs can also be sequencers, 32 mod slots, and an additional 8 macros, which can have 8 destinations each. Also note, macros can modulate macros, macros can adjust mod slots can adjust mod slots can adjust macros. So there is a whole range of possibilities here that goes well beyond what you would see in most hardware synthesizers. Another standout feature for me are the mutants. So these are audio effects which are applied to the outputs of the oscillators. I think this adds a lot of possibilities for shaping sounds in ways that might not be accessible otherwise. One of the things that I try and do when designing sounds is I try and use as little as possible to get to the sound that I'm trying to achieve. So that means if I could just use the oscillators to get the sound that I wanted, then I wouldn't touch the rest of the signal path. The reason is that if I then need to iterate upon the sound, I can do that by adding movement further down the signal generation path. This is much easier than using everything and then trying to go in and make changes. So the power of the oscillator section here, with the wave scanning, with the mutants, with the adjustable ring mod, the different colors of noise all before you hit the mixer, gives you a lot. Dual filters. I like having the 2 filters. The parallel and the serial mode is good. I actually wish the modes from filter 2 were available in filter 1. I can understand why the filter 1 modes aren't in filter 2 because I think they're more CPU intensive, but the other way around, maybe that would have worked. The effects, none of them really stand out for me, but none of them are bad either. And I think that's something of a story of the synthesizer as a whole. It does everything quite well, but it doesn't do anything that makes me say, wow, that's amazing. Like these effects, by the time you modulate them, they can sound really interesting. There are loads of features in the voice options that you just don't see anywhere else. But sonically, I think this is where it falls a little bit short, which is quite unfortunate because it's a synthesizer. There is something that I don't find that pleasing about the basic sound of the oscillators, the basic sound of the filter, the different modeled filters, the effects themselves. Somehow it all falls a bit flat for me, and that is what keeps it from being that synthesizer that I'm going to go to all the time. If I want something where I can just dial up a lead, just dial up a sort of analog poly sound, dial up a bass, dial up a pluck, I know if I need polyphonic, I can always count on peak. It will always just sound good. I know if I need monophonic, the bass station, again, I can rely on it. It's going to sound good and it's going to be easy to design a sound on. I feel like to get that out of this synthesizer needs the sound to be fine-tuned and dialed in. That doesn't necessarily make this an unusable synthesizer. You can certainly get some excellent sounds out of it, but I feel like getting excellent sounds is a lot of work. And I think that leads into what I like about this synthesizer. What I like about this synthesizer is because it's taken this kitchen sink approach, it has a range of modulations, modulation sources, and features that are just not really seen in other synthesizers. And I think that scope, or at least hardware synthesizers, I think that scope lends itself to creative sound design. So by that I mean you can make sounds full of interesting movement, interesting variation, which will catch the listener's ear, not necessarily because of their subtle and appealing pure timbre, but because of the clever movement and the clever design that you've done on those sounds. And I think the interface has been designed in a way that manages that complexity very well. This whole paradigm of moving into these sections and the ability to hit init, that's just initialized oscillator 3, random 1, I've just randomized envelope 1. That workflow is really fast. That ability to just go through my parameters here in any of these sections, excellent. But it's also meant that not many of the controls are on the panel. And I think this has therefore put a lot of the controls and the parameters as peers. They are all this sort of one press and a knob turn away. And to me, that takes away a little bit from the experience I want from a hardware synthesizer. Now let me step back and talk about what I like in a hardware synthesizer. I'm not someone who makes and then saves a lot of presets. I'm somebody who has a need for a sound, designs that sound, performs that sound, and records that sound. I'm also someone who, if I was playing live, enjoy making the sound as I proceed. Now, this design of synthesizer, while it allows ready access to a wide range of parameters, is not quite there for real-time live sound design. Well, how do you compensate for that? You compensate for that by designing your sounds offline and making your macro assignments. Then you have your 8 macros, which you can perform live. And I think that is where this really shines. It's a hardware synthesizer where you design a finely crafted sound and you make macro controls for it, and then it becomes very performable. I've mentioned previously, and I think having used this synthesizer for more time, I agree with myself. I wish they had basically eliminated the arpeggiator section controls because they take up a lot of panel space. Made the filter controls vertical, shifted this whole main section off to one side, and gone for the larger Hydrasynth form factor of having the 8 encoders and the additional displays and additional buttons. Because for me, this is where the strength of this sound engine lies. And I guess you've seen, I don't really use an arpeggiator very much. I like playing the keyboard. And therefore, this is wasted on me, and this to me implies that this is a performance synthesizer, but this is not a performance synthesizer for real-time sound design. So to me, it has this split personality of being very good at sound design, but not being good at live sound design, and having an interface optimized for live performance, but live sound design doesn't work that well. And it reminds me of another synthesizer, which I actually bought, but ended up returning. That was the Yamaha MoDX. I really enjoyed it for the time that I had it, but I found it almost unusable for designing sounds live. And what it demanded of me was offline sound design, macro assignment, saving that, and making a patch set that I could navigate through. And that didn't really sit well with the way that I work. That doesn't mean it won't sit well with the way that you work. Let me compare this to the other models. So I think I'm okay with mini keys. I'm also okay with a 37 key keybed. Yes, I mean, I have a digital piano 88 key. My main controller is a 61 key. I have a 49 key that I use. I'm quite happy on a range of keyboard sizes, but this is perfectly acceptable. And it maps very nicely to software synthesizers. So I have a lot of the controls mapped to pigments, so I can do a lot of sound design there. And I think that brings me to another comparison point here. I've mentioned that I'm not quite happy with the sound of this synthesizer, and I don't think it's because it's a digital synthesizer. I think it's something about the implementation, because the OP6, I really like the sound of the filters there. I think the analog modeling is excellent. It has resonance which can go out of control, but it has that softness and smoothness and just a general character that I enjoy. In contrast, the filters here feel a little flat, and they don't feel as out of control as they could be. And to me, for a sound design forward synth, I want the maximum timbre range that I can achieve, and I think it gets held back a little there. I think also when I listen to this compared to something like Pigments, Pigments has a polish to it. This has, to me, an unusual combination of something of a polish, but with a lo-fi kind of undercurrent. And that gives it a character. And that's something that I wouldn't say for many digital synthesizers. I would say a lot of digital synthesizers are or can be characterless. So this is a characterful digital synthesizer, but make sure that you like the character if you're going for it, or that you are going to spend the time to design the sounds with the subtlety required to overcome that character and make it sound like something else. Other things of note, yeah, just thinking about it, whenever I play Pigments through it, I wish that the sound of Pigments was the sound of this synthesizer, because if that happened, this would be, I think, the synthesizer that I would go to every day, every time. As it is a synthesizer which works very well for complicated sounds. It works well for subtle ambience, it works well for the complicated droning sounds, and it works well as a controller. And I think I could say that it is an excellent synth for the price. And that is unfortunate, because I would like to say it is an excellent synth. End of story, irrespective of the price. The reason I say that is this is the cheapest of the family of Hydrasynths. So if you go for the Hydrasynth desktop, it is more expensive than this. Now it has the 8 encoders, but it doesn't have a traditional keyboard. It has a polyphonic aftertouch grid. And you're getting the same sound engine. And for me, it's only a little more expensive. It probably still is a good synthesizer for the price. You go to the 49 key, and the 49 key is actually one that I used first. I used it at an event in LA when it was just launched. And when I listened to it, I thought, I like the way it feels, I like the way it looks, I like the concept. I'm not sure about the sound, and unfortunately I haven't really overcome that in having this synthesizer. So for the 49 key, if you love that polyphonic aftertouch and if you want a 49 key keyboard, I think it's still a reasonable choice. But the price is getting up there, and then I start to think, well, there is competition here. Whereas at this price, there isn't that much competition. The obvious competition is probably the Mini Freak. Interestingly, I said that this is fairly unique in having audio effects for the oscillators, but the Mini Freak can use the second oscillator as an effect for the first. Not as deep in that regard. This has two effects for each of the first two oscillators plus a third oscillator, but features like that exist. The Hydrasynth Deluxe, I think the strength is in being able to layer two of these sound engines. And to me, that does lean towards the benefits of this synth, because I've said it's interesting for complex sound design. So I can imagine if you can layer two of these patches and if you can use the macros in some combined and interesting way, you can come up with some very interesting sound design. So I think if you really want maximum sound design potential, then maybe the Deluxe is the way to go. But at the same time, for meticulous sound design, I tend to go to software. So at that point, I've got, say, Zebra, I think an excellent synthesizer, Dune, also an excellent synthesizer, and I think they can really sound great. And obviously Pigments I've already mentioned. So there is a lot of competition in that domain for making these complicated sounds. So I'm struggling to understand where, for my workflow, the Hydrasynth Deluxe would work, but I can imagine that there are sound designers out there who would find it an excellent match. So hopefully that's enough talking and has given you my overall impression of the synthesizer. That's to say, a synthesizer that I think is great for the money, but I wish it could have been knocked out of the park. Let's listen to some presets now. So I'm going to browse them by category, and I've mentioned where I thought it had strength, so ambient. I'm just going to spin the wheel, and I'm going to try and play. So interesting, I feel like it's taking advantage of some of that motion quite well. Good sounding patch, good sounding ambience. Let's move on. Another good sounding patch, a nice use of the aftertouch there as well. I think it adds some real character to it. A thing which I guess I didn't really mention is I think a lot of the user interface, unsurprisingly, was designed for the original Hydrasynth, which had the 8 encoders, and I think that has resulted in some design compromises in the way the user interface operates. So certain things end up being just a little bit less convenient, I think, on this version and feeling a little less natural. So one qualifier, one pinch of salt to take with what I said is if you did go for any of them except for this one, you would have those 8 encoders and you would have those 8 buttons. So maybe the sound design experience would be opened up a little bit more and feel a little bit more fluid. Not that it's bad, but anyway. Another patch. Again, patch sounds good. Highlighted another annoyance that I've had in using the synthesizer, which is depending on the parameter you are adjusting by one of the envelopes or even the LFOs, if the envelope or LFO resets, then sometimes it has a very jarring motion. So you have to be careful whether setting envelopes to reset or not, and whether you actually need the LFOs to be polysynced. In that case, we could hear voices being stolen, and I think that voice stealing is kind of obtrusive because of the way those resets sound. In most polysynths, I feel like 8 voices is okay because unless you're unison stacking, usually in produced music, you're just playing those two-handed chords, and unless the voice stealing sounds really bad, 8 voices works for you. In this case, because of that, it may be interesting to get the 16 voice, so that may be another reason why you'd go for the Hydrasynth Deluxe, because you're making these long release sounds and you don't want voice stealing. Let's move to a different category. So that was ambient. Let's try effects. Let's fly in a bit. So I guess you can hear that some of the magic here is all hidden in the macros. So an interesting sounding patch there. A thing that I may not have noted is that the macros can be CC controlled. So if you're using this with something that can record CC, it's possible to automate those parameters. And I think for some of the use cases I can imagine, it might be interesting to automate those rather than trying to perform them, because especially when you only have 4 available at a time, it's a little bit inconvenient. Let's move on. Now let's do another one from here. The timbre is quite interesting. They've sort of used the delay almost, you can get it into this car plus strong pluck string kind of territory. I'm not quite sure what they were going for there, but it's interesting, and I could imagine if you were trying to do some like Foley or something for video, I think you could use something like that. Let's go to another category. That was effects. What's FX music? Let's just pick one. So this is Monophonic. So we can see the stepped LFO motion going here. So again, for me, an example of that more is more kind of approach. When everything is stacked on top of each other, when you apply all of the things that are available here, then you have the capacity to make something which is quite compelling. Let's pick another one. Monophonic. So this is an example of the type of patch where I think you could do a performance just playing this. I think it has enough motion and enough complexity in the macros that you could just sit down, press one key, and turn these knobs and do something which was actually compelling. Again, a strength of the synthesizer. Let's move on. So what else have we got? I'm going to try and jump into pads quickly and just do this fast. Where was I? Okay, not super interesting. Let's pick another. Another. Interesting brassy sort of sound. Let's move on to Rhythmic. Okay, polyphonic. Okay, another. Another patch makes me think you wouldn't expect to be getting that from this price category of hardware synthesizer. Enough motion, enough complexity that it just sounds like something more. Another in this category. Another pretty interesting sound. Let's try sequences. What have they got? There are a few. Interesting how much that transformed from something that was kind of clean and kind of dull to something which was much more Timbrally and texturally complex. One more. So hopefully it's a good one. Okay, so I think that's hopefully demonstrated a little bit of the type of sounds that I think this excels at. Now, I didn't pick those sounds, I just sort of randomly selected them, so probably they don't demonstrate the synth as best as they could, but hopefully they give you a flavour of what's available here. And I think if you enjoy that flavour, if you like those sounds, then you will like this synthesizer. I think it does about as good a job as it could of managing the complexity. I think it's not an ideal fit for my typical use case, but as I've said, I am going to be keeping this synthesizer and I'm sure I'm going to be using this synthesizer often. And I think that brings me to the end of this series. This has been Learn With Me on the ASM Hydrasynth Explorer. I am hoping that if I come across some other interesting synthesizers, or if I decide to do it for some software synthesizers, that I will do some more Learn With Me series. But in any case, I'd like to thank you for joining me for this series, for joining me today, and goodbye.